Senator, earlier today, Twitter announced its support for some legislation that you are also in favor of regarding political ads. Is this a step in the right direction?
We now have Facebook and Twitter on record supporting what we call the Honest Ads Act, which makes sure that any political ad, whether it mentions a candidate or not, that viewers of those ads on social media will understand who sponsored that ad, who paid for that ad, the same kind of disclosure that has to take place on television and radio. That's a good sign, but we've got to hear from Google, YouTube, a portion of Google, Reddit, a series of other social media platforms, and we can't have this be kind of an opt-in or opt-out. We need a legislative solution, and actually this is only a small part of the problem. As we saw in 2016, the biggest part of the abuse of social media was not the paid advertising, but was the creation of fake accounts where people could spread false information supplemented by automated bots. And so far on that question, we've not heard a direct answer from Mr. Zuckerberg, Facebook, or any of the social media companies.
Correct me if I'm wrong, I believe Senator McCain is the only Republican who's on board with this in the Senate.
Senator McCain is the only Republican at this point. My hope is that other Republicans will join now that Facebook and Twitter have come out in favor of this legislation. And this would be an important step forward, but this is by no means getting our arms around the full problem of how social media can be manipulated. And the truth is, in today's world, even if you're not a Facebook subscriber, even if you're not a regular participant of Google, you can't opt out of social media. Your identity will fall into that realm, and as we've seen, and with firms like Cambridge Analytica, that information can be misused and abused in ways that many of the users, and frankly, the friends of those users who had their data then used by the Trump campaign, weren't even aware of.
You know, it's quite remarkable because that issue with political advertising, as you said, it only scratches the surface. A common thread that came up during the hearing that we've been reporting on is whether or not the European regulatory regime model might be something that the United States could adopt. Mark Zuckerberg testified that potentially it could, but he's not sure that it would be fully applicable. Your Republican colleague, Senator Graham, after the hearing, raised concerns about that and saying, well, what regulations then would he be able to support? My question to you, do you like the European model, and is it applicable to the United States?
Well, I think there is a series of ideas that we ought to explore. One idea is the exemption that was granted to all the social media companies back in the 90s when they were just starting. They basically said they had no requirement at all to oversee or curate any of the information that flows across their platforms. That's called Section 230. Mm-hmm. We've seen some cutting back on that. For example, we passed legislation recently that said you can't do sex trafficking over these social media platforms. There may be other areas that could be explored. There's areas that could be explored that goes beyond the question of political content that says if a content originates from a foreign source, perhaps that is a piece of information that would at least allow people, if somebody says they're Kevin from Washington, but it's actually Boris from St. Petersburg and it pops up originating from Russia, that might be an item. There's another policy area that could be explored. I was an old telecom guy. Around data portability. If you could go ahead and you got tired of being on Facebook because they weren't protecting your information, could you move to another social media platform? Could you make it easy then to move all of your data? And then actually you still got a question then of what's called interoperability, so you could still talk to your friends who are on Facebook. So there's a question of data portability. And then there's this question as what the Europeans are looking at, which really kind of flips a lot of the model on its head and says that most of the information, rather than being owned by the social media companies, who you agree to these long, extensive terms of service that nobody reads, right, that actually consumers would continue to own all that information, and there'd have to be some compensation model. So I think there's a wide array of options, and what I've tried to encourage Mr. Zuckerberg and others is, if Congress tries to do this on its own, a lot of my colleagues, aren't that expertise in technology. I spent a career in tech before I came to Congress. I've been on this issue of social media for the last 16 months. We need the input of the tech companies, or we could probably mess up the solution. So I would hope Mr. Zuckerberg and his colleagues would actually come forward with what they could support and which of these ideas might be the best way to pursue.
I want to quickly follow up on the point of terms of agreement, because that was another common thread that emerged in terms of this hearing. And it is, I think, quite remarkable to the extent that the Beltway is getting educated on these issues, but the average American, rightfully so, is preoccupied with a host of other issues. With regards to terms of agreement, are you satisfied with what Facebook is asking folks to understand when they're creating an account?
I'm not sure we can make any terms of agreement simple enough that people would actually take the time to sort it through. So that's why some people have advocated, if you allowed us as individuals to keep that information and retain that information, and a social media company would have to compensate you for using that information, there would be companies that would, in effect, disintermediate between you as a user and the platform that might, in effect, take on some of those responsibilities. I'm not saying that's the right answer, but there is a menu of options that we need to sit down and roll up our sleeves and work on, because these problems are not going to go away. They're only going to get worse. We're still trying to get our arms around basically 2016 technology. Right. When, as we've discussed in the past, the next wave of technology, which allows someone's face to appear on somebody else's body, so-called deep fake technology, is coming soon, and that's going to make these problems exponentially worse.
Quickly, just final on Facebook. Is Facebook a monopoly?
They control an awful lot of content. Matter of fact, over half of Americans get their news from Facebook or another social media platform every day. I think we need to look at their role in society. Now again, Mr. Zuckerberg makes some apologies today, but he needs to roll up his sleeves and work with us on a policy solution. I don't want to get rid of the innovation, and I don't want to replace these companies with Chinese tech companies who are simply one step, in certain ways, even further along on more intrusion, but we've got to get this right.
It's a brave new world. Should Americans feel safe? I've asked every senator I've interviewed today, should Americans feel safe that their political institutions are going to be protected ahead of the midterms?
We are not as safe as we need to be.
Why not? I mean,
one of the reasons has been, in a normal administration, a president would have convened a working group on election security when it was clear that a foreign country, Russia, intervened in our elections. And all of Mr. Trump's appointees in intelligence and law enforcement have acknowledged that. He has not made that a priority. So our Intelligence Committee did come up with a series of bipartisan recommendations about paper trail, making sure everybody's got appropriate security clearance so he could share information, $386 million of additional aid to states and local election systems to upgrade the equipment. Because at the end of the day, whoever wants to interfere doesn't actually have to change a vote total. They just have to make us question the legitimacy of our results, and they can undermine our democracy.
You mentioned Russia. I want to talk about Syria. What response would be an adequate response with regard to the latest chemical attack by the Assad regime?
Well, I worry that this president's kind of, depending on which day he wakes up, his views on foreign policy seem to change. I worry in many ways whether the president saying 10 days ago or so that he thought we should be getting out of Syria, basically without even consulting his military and foreign policy team, may have indirectly given Assad somewhat of a green light to say they could push further in trying to claim victory. I've been very concerned why Assad, who's been actually successful at rooting out a lot of the rebels, would resort to this kind of extraordinarily heinous behavior. And America and the world does need to respond. But this is, again,
militarily?
I think all options, including militarily, need to be on the table, absolutely. But this is where a president who has kind of an American-only foreign policy is not able to rally the rest of the world against this kind of atrocity.
I feel like I've asked you this every time I've interviewed you, but also in the news. Final question for you about Bob Mueller and whether or not President Trump is going to fire him. I mean, I know you're going to tell me he shouldn't be fired, but there's been a lot of back and forth about whether or not the president has the right to do that. Your thoughts?
I'm not a legal scholar on this, but I actually on this one agree with my friend Lindsey Graham, Republican senator from South Carolina. If Trump tries to fire Mueller, it's the beginning of the end of his presidency. And the fact that what is equally abhorrent to me is these ad hominem attacks that comes out of this White House against the integrity of virtually everybody at the FBI, the Department of Justice, and the irony being that the individuals who are leading this investigation, or head of the FBI, or the Deputy Attorney General, Mr. Rosenstein, Mr. Mueller, the special prosecutor, they are all lifelong Republicans. Now, I don't question their integrity because they're Republicans. They're doing their job that the law has asked them to enforce. And when the president basically attacks all of their integrity, he basically is starting to send out a signal that he or someone can choose which laws they're going to follow and which laws we don't follow. That puts our country in very dangerous ground.